I was thinking a lot while reading this chapter about those dudes, those fathers who say shit like, I'm babysitting my kids. Bitch, they're your kids. You're not babysitting them. That's part of the labor of being a parent.
Yeah.
Hello.
Hey,
Welcome to Left Unread. My name is Aaron.
I'm Will.
We are two dudes engaged in a radical self-education.
We're two objects of labor desperately trying to realize our value. How about that?
There you go. That works. And this go-round, we are reading Women, Race, and Class by Angela Y. Davis.
Yes, the illustrious Angela Davis. If you think of the 60s as the last real vanguard movement, then Angela Davis is surely one of the old guard. Born in Alabama in 1944, Angela Davis became increasingly radical through her studies. Hilariously, she actually cites the Girl Scouts as a pivotal organization for her youth resistance.
Radicalization.
Yeah, she, marched against racism in Alabama and whatnot. But anyway, she became increasingly radical through her studies. It landed her at the University of Berlin in the DDR in East Germany. Upon her return, she became a pivotal figure in the civil rights movement, the Communist Party, the Black Panthers, the prison abolition movement, women's liberation, and so much more. Walking the fine line between academic and activist, Miss Davis has been lauded by both sides of the ideological spectrum, ranging from being named Times Woman of the Year in 1971 to receiving the Lenin Peace Prize in 1979. And who knows what happened after that? I mean, she kind of just dropped off the face of the earth, right?
Yeah, well, speaking of right after that, written in 1981, Women, Race, and Class is a collection of essays examining the history of sexist, racist, classist exploitation in the United States, starting with the enslavement of Africans through the women's liberation movement of the 60s and 70s. Davis's work delineates the intersections of gender, race, and class in the enslavement of Africans in the ensuing abolitionist movement, the women's suffrage movement, and the women's liberation movement, illustrating how these multipliers of marginalization have been ignored by liberation movements of the past, weakening and ultimately self-sabotaging the underlying message of liberation at their core. Above all, a call for unity through intersectional liberation, Women, Race, and Class challenges readers to examine our own participation in systems of oppression through the conscious and unconscious ways we exclude and discount other forms of marginalization, even when fighting for our own emancipation.
Hell yeah. Well, I think that that's a great place to start, is that this is a book about intersectionality.
Yeah.
The biggest message that I was able to take from this book is that the liberation of all is the goal. This is a very historical book. She does a lot of examination of the women's movement, the suffrage movement, the abolitionist movement, and how those things kind of interconnect. And really the biggest message I could take is that, all of these struggles are completely wrapped together. It's a disservice to the whole movement to maybe try to push one to the side for the inclusion of the other. Maybe not even inclusion there, but I just think that that's really the case here. It's like, we're talking about intersectionality here. To be Black, a woman, and a worker is a triple threat, right? She calls it triple jeopardy in the book.
Yeah.
And so it's just important to understand that we can't necessarily really focus on one to the exclusion of the others. They really have to be wrapped together.
I think primarily the underlying message of the book is that the histories of these previous liberation movements that we have been taught, like the abolitionist movement, the women's suffrage movement, etc., are incomplete histories at best because of the exclusion of these intersections.
Yeah.
And the outright exclusion by leaders of those movements at times. It reminded me a lot, I was thinking a lot of the Audre Lorde quote while reading this about, I'll paraphrase it, of course, I won't get it exactly, but it's, I am not free while any woman is unfree, even if her chains are very different than my own.
Yeah.
And I think it's important for us to keep that in mind when we're talking about liberation, that recognition of intersectional, because no liberation movement is truly a liberation movement if it isn't intersectional.
Yeah, I think that that's totally valid.
Broadly speaking, I think that this book is just it goes in chronological order, and it covers a timeline of these liberatory movements in the United States specifically, and examines how the intersections of being a woman, being a Black woman, and being a Black working woman were acknowledged or not acknowledged during those liberation movements. So I don't necessarily know that a chapter by chapter kind of rehashing of that makes a lot of sense.
Sure.
Because it is truly largely a history.
Yeah.
Maybe it's a reanalysis of history through a Marxist lens, through a particular lens or something like that. But given that, I think maybe just kind of talking about some of the ideas presented underlying might make the most sense.
Yeah, I don't necessarily think that the history is specifically worth talking about, summarizing Mostly because, I mean, as we kind of talked about outside of the recording here, a lot of the history is stuff that if you remember your high school history class, you'll probably remember, outside of maybe specifically the communist stuff. But a lot of these figures are figures that are very notable in U.S. textbooks. This book was written in 1981, and maybe it was more revelatory then. I mean, that was really my feeling, especially in the middle of the book, It's interesting. I didn't think of it maybe as a reanalysis because a lot of it was so... I don't know. For today's standard, it was very on its face. You know what I mean?
It's hard not to speak about it anachronistically because I wasn't born until 1984, and I certainly wasn't thinking about socialism when I was a wee lad. But maybe a part of why so much of this feels self-evident is because of the work of this book and others like it. I know Bell Hooks is often cited alongside Angela Davis as kind of moving the women's liberation movement forward through a womanist lens.
Yeah.
And so maybe it just feels almost self-evident because of the strength of this book.
It's true. That's valid.
It's hard to say, but I think to a modern reader that has any exposure to leftist analysis, this should all be pretty self-evident.
What's a good theme that you picked down? I don't know. What's a good place to start?
Well, certainly the underlying thesis is a call to intersectional analysis.
Mm-hmm.
And while reading all of these stories, she has a kind of almost approaches a lot of these stories almost like Howard Zinn, using a lot of primary text from people that participated in these movements. And while I was reading through it, I just kept thinking a lot about the kind of invisibility of other oppressions.
Sure.
And how so many liberation movements seem to be bogged down by their inability to see others' chains.
Yeah.
And I don't know, I guess I was just thinking a little bit about that. I have a couple of quotes that we could jump to for that.
Yeah, I think that's a good place to start because... Yeah, it goes back to that thing, putting one movement in the forefront, like you said in the intro, right? There is an unconscious element to it where it is still affecting these other movements in a way, and it's just something that really has to be kept in mind as we're trying to construct this ultimate movement, maybe. I'm just thinking about the ways in which, the suffragist movement, in their eagerness for expediency, right? They've not only pushed aside the whole race of black people, essentially. But on top of that, they're also allowing a victimization of their own people, It's like a rebound effect. You know what I mean? She says it in the book here. I actually have a couple quotes here. On 177, for once, white men were persuaded that they could commit sexual assaults against black women with impunity. Their conduct towards women of their own race could not have remained unmarred. White women in the United States have necessarily suffered the ricochet fire of these attacks. This is one of the many ways in which racism nourishes sexism, causing white women to be indirectly victimized by the special oppression aimed at their systems of color.
Yeah.
Right? That's kind of the overriding message for me in this whole book is just that, that focus, as good as their intentions might have been, which they were not necessarily well-intentioned.
Yeah, they were quick to capitulate. Yeah.
Right. That strategy not only hurt the opposite side of the movement, right? The actual oppressed people, but it also hurts your own movement, you know? It's just that kind of need for pragmatism that we just have to be aware of. I mean, honestly, what I was thinking about a lot in this book was opportunism, not to put it into jargon or anything, but you see very clearly how a lot of these movements start with very broad sweeping ideals, and then they feel as if they're forced to narrow their scope for some kind of pragmatic ideal, for some kind of expediency, even if in the end it's not worth it at all, and you just see the effects of that narrowing, that opportunism, right? Because it's damaging the whole equation, right? It's a setback to the movement as a whole.
Yeah, and that quote that you pointed out on 177, I had those exact lines highlighted as well, and I wrote in the margin that dehumanizing any woman opens the door to the dehumanization of all women. And it got me thinking a lot about TERFs today.
Yeah.
Being trans exclusive is... the J.K. Rowlings of the world or whatever that think that they're propagating some sort of feminist ideology are not recognizing that they're cutting off their own feet by doing so. Not even to mention the fact that it's ideologically inconsistent. They're not even seeing that they're sharpening the blade that's going to attack them.
Yeah, I love that example because that was the first thought I had, because it's right now happening. Ultimately, all of these anti-transgender regulations will come back to hurt women.
Yeah.
Even if your intention as a radical feminist or whatever you want to call yourself, is to protect women, to create safety for women, to, all of these things, which are hugely valid, right? I understand why you feel that way.
Yeah, the motive.
Yes, thank you. But you are hurting other people that are really being oppressed right now, and then in the long run, you are going to hurt yourself.
Yeah.
That's the exact same thing. It's the exact same thing. I love that example.
Yeah. And I have a couple other quotes to go along with that, too. This is where Davis is still talking about the post-Civil War period of abolition. That first full paragraph, even the most radical white abolitionists, basing their opposition to slavery on moral and humanitarian grounds, failed to understand that the rapidly developing capitalism of the North was also an oppressive system. They viewed slavery as a detestable and inhuman institution, an archaic transgression of justice, but they did not recognize that the white worker in the North, his or her status as, quote, free laborer notwithstanding, was no different from the enslaved worker in the South. Both were victims of economic exploitation.
Yeah.
There's a really important acknowledgement there of the intersection of race and class. And it was, again, calling to mind to me Bell Hooks's, what she called the imperialist white supremacist capitalist patriarchy. It's the kind of interlocking nature of systems like this that create oppression. And you can't stand by one and disavow the other.
Yeah.
It's impossible to separate them, even if you're too blind to see that.
Yeah. I love the way she says it on 122. The suffrage movement had opted for an obstacle course which placed its own goal of women's suffrage in continuous jeopardy. You're putting obstacles in your own path, ultimately.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, and it's wrapped up throughout this whole book, too. Honestly, a fantastic encapsulation of the whole thing, I think, can be found on 201. Just to give a trigger warning, there's a lot of discussion in this book about rape. So
yeah, there's a whole chapter specifically on sexual assault.
So, in this chapter, she's talking broadly about rape. And she says, an effective strategy against rape must aim for more than the eradication of rape, or even of sexism. The struggle against racism must be an ongoing theme of the anti-rape movement, which must not only defend women of color, but the many victims of racist manipulation of the rape charge as well. The crisis dimensions of sexual violence constitute one of the facets of a deep and ongoing crisis of capitalism. As the violent face of sexism, the threat of rape will continue to exist as long as the overall oppression of women remains an essential crutch for capitalism.
Yep.
Right? There's a bit of a discomfort in talking about an identity politic because sometimes it might feel like you're platforming one idea over the other. And I just really love the way that she describes it here as a facet of the ongoing crisis, right? What I'm trying to avoid is class reductionism.
Yeah.
Is just to be like, well, it all boils down to class. Don't worry about race or whatever. That's clearly not what we're saying here. It's just that to look at just racism is only to view one portion of a much larger structure, which is capitalism.
Exactly. I have a couple other that I'd kind of like to string together, and maybe I can make something coherent out of it. We're going to go way back to page 12.
All right.
And again, sorry for the length of these quotes. Some of them only kind of make sense when they're fully contextualized. But here she's talking about the terrible treatment of enslaved women. And she says, as the ideology of femininity, a byproduct of industrialization, was popularized and disseminated through the New Ladies magazines and romantic novels, white women came to be seen as inhabitants of a sphere totally severed from the realm of productive work.
Yes.
The cleavage between the home and the public economy brought on by industrial capitalism established female inferiority more firmly than ever before.
Yeah.
So there was already a bifurcation happening where enslaved women's labor was not being qualified as productive labor because they weren't being viewed as women.
Right.
They were being dehumanized. They were being represented as something, as an animal, less than as a person. But even then, that dehumanization had another side where white women and this kind of propping up of a particular image. She talks a lot about motherhood moving forward at this period.
Yeah.
Creates this separation where they are not even qualified as productive laborers either. They're being separated in the same sort of way, more as paragons of this romantic ideal of what a woman is supposed to be.
Yeah.
And I think that also goes along with, to go to 97.
Okay.
Again, back to how there are kind of invisible complicity in exploitative systems, how we can perpetuate it ourselves. Mm-hmm. White women kind of took this idea of the motherhood ideal or whatever and kind of ran with it. And we get this quote where Davis writes, "This feminist activist was perpetuating the very oppression she protested, yet her contradictory behavior and her inordinate insensitivity are not without explanation, for people who work as servants are generally viewed as less than human beings." So again, this kind of almost like radical dehumanization of black women
Yeah.
that separates them from a liberatory movement for women. But then white women themselves, by creating that separation, are creating yet another kind of hurdle between them and their own liberation. And it's just like, it's this self-sabotaging, self-perpetuating system where we can't see where, when we don't see how our marginalizations are connected, we tend to ultimately kind of contribute to our own marginalization.
Yeah. Two thoughts here, and both of these could lead us in wildly different directions. One, I think, is that the concept of motherhood as an ideology, you know, the femininity, the ideology of femininity. What the fuck? The feminine ideology. What the fuck, man? Moving on, you know what I mean. That ideal is constructed. It is 150 years old max, right? And it comes from the industrialization. It comes in the change in our modes of production. I think that that's a huge thing, because that creation of that identity is not natural. It's not inherent. It's something that is forced upon us. And maybe the establishment of that ideal, the reinforcing of that ideal, it's dialectical. I mean, it's working in both directions, right? Like, talking about the way that black people were viewed in that kind of, like, what does she say? Mistress-maid relationship, right? I'm thinking of the Frederick Douglass quote when he says that, I'm not going to use his exact language, but he says that the black person is the servant is the black person. You know, like the two ideals reinforce each other.
Yeah.
Right? That's one thing there. Another thing that made me think about is it's a divide and conquer strategy. You know what I mean? She even talks about it later when she's talking about...
This is very similar to the way the narrative around black men as sexual deviants shifted after emancipation. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh my God. All of the stuff about, like, there were no lynchings during the Civil War, what happened after, all of that stuff is like a shattering fact. You know, if you have any kind of pre-informed conception of the black rapist, you know, like, that alone is a real severing moment, I think.
Yeah. And that was Douglas's primary argument. There were no reported sexual assaults by enslaved black men during the Civil War.
Yeah.
Why are suddenly there's this complete shift in black masculinity post-emancipation? It makes absolutely no sense. There's also a really ironic thing. So, you know, we're going to start talking about tropes.
Sure.
When we're talking about that, we're going to talk about caricatures and tropes, like the quote, the black brute, as the sexual deviant that's constantly going after white women.
The horde of black men charging with their penises erect.
Yeah. What an image. But the irony of the flip side of that is the quote, I think she calls it loose and lascivious black woman, the Jezebel, so to speak. Sex requires at least two parties. To have a woman that is willing to have sex is not a mind-blowing thing. Like, a white man needs to participate, needs to want to have sex. It's a bonkers trope. It's a bonkers caricature to put a moral judgment on a black woman willing to have sex and no moral judgment on the white man willing to have sex.
Yeah.
He was a good Christian man that was held down by her wiles or something.
I mean,
what the fuck?
You know, it's just another extension of male supremacy. Like, even the example she gives of the very earliest rape laws were to protect white men.
Yeah.
You know, because their wives and daughters might be subject to rape. It's like, it's not for the protection of the woman at all.
Yeah,
you know,
thus devaluing them when making a trade for marriage, so to speak.
Exactly. Yeah. What the fuck, man?
Yeah.
Yeah. But I wanted to get back to that.
Sorry.
She's talking specifically about the white working class. They are disempowered because of their status as working men.
Oh, yeah, I have it here, yeah.
And she says, the incentive is not nearly as powerful as it is for men of the capitalist class. When the working class men accept the invitation to rape extended by the ideology of male supremacy, they are accepting a bribe, an illusory compensation for their powerlessness.
Yeah.
You know, I'm thinking again of the middle class as the enforcers of capitalism, you know, like, we're passing down all of these ideals filtered through this very strange middle class conception as a means of shielding what is essentially the upper classes from the repercussions of their exploitation. You know?
Well said.
It's fucked up, man. But, you know, and actually that's a great way to weave those two ideas together, that conception of femininity and that kind of illusory compensation from the middle class, is that the idea of the housewife is a middle class conception, right? The rich socialites obviously are not doing the housework. They pay people to do it for them, right? Maybe the middle class should be eradicated. Maybe we should eradicate. Maybe this isn't a safe space for the middle class. that's what I'm slowly deciding here. Yeah, here's an interesting way to start another one here. This is how she starts the chapter on rape, which is...
Chapter 11, yeah.
Yeah. Right. Some of the most flagrant symptoms of social deterioration are acknowledged as serious problems only when they have assumed such epidemic proportions that they appear to defy solution. I love the framing of that because she's acknowledging almost the systemalization of this process, like the institutionalization. And I think of it doubly when she talks about lynch law. Like, lynching existed before the Civil War, but after the Civil War, lynching became essentially an institution of domination, right? A reinforcement of hegemonic control over the South.
Yeah.
And I'm just thinking about, like, the way that those maybe kind of, I almost said extrajudicial, but they were certainly sanctioned at the very least.
Yeah.
Institutions are coming into play. I don't know where I was going with this.
Well, I have a quote on 190 that kind of speaks to that.
Yeah.
The colonization of the Southern economy by capitalists from the North gave lynching its most vigorous impulse. If black people, by means of terror and violence, could remain the most brutally exploited group within the swelling ranks of the working class, the capitalists could enjoy a double advantage. Extra profits would result from the super exploitation of black labor, and white workers' hostilities toward their employers would be diffused.
This is actually the quote I was looking for when I was talking about that divide and conquer, because it's that same thing. That other example was also a good one, but it's the same thing, right? Where super exploitation is not something we've encountered in like a definition sense, you know? It's that double advantage, right? It's almost intersectional again, like they're doubly exploited because they are both working class and black. It is literally intersectional again.
Okay, I have a couple of maybe weird comments about this. First, I will say when I was first learning about liberation theory and becoming more radicalized, I guess, over time, or at least educating myself a little bit more around radical ideas that I already had, I would say that I recognized the ills of racism, and I saw classism as a weapon to perpetuate racism. Where the more educated I've become, I've inverted that. I see racism more as a weapon to perpetuate classism. And I think that shift is important and illustrated really well by this quote on 190, because black workers are being exploited as workers, just like every other proletarian is, but they're also being exploited racially. But white workers who are being exploited as proletarians see the exploitation of black workers as an opportunity to harness some sort of power, some sort of social power over them, and therefore they don't acknowledge their own marginalization as proletarians. So there's like a really interesting, like you were saying, super exploitation or double exploitation happening that also creates a barrier to building a unified class consciousness across proletarians.
Yeah, you're too busy looking down the chain to notice that there's anyone above you.
Exactly. And it also, so I don't know that this will make the episode, but I spent the last couple of days working with my old man. Yeah. And my dad lives in Springfield, Ohio, which made the news cycle recently. Because there are about 15,000 Haitian immigrants that were brought into the city and given sanctuary, basically, and provided some services by the city to try to help them make a life. This has created a lot of resentment among working class white folks in Springfield, largely because they're racists. But another part of it is because they're recognizing to some degree that they are not being afforded things from the state that these Haitian immigrants are being afforded. Right. And there's nothing wrong with that recognition, with that realization. What's wrong is directing one's anger toward the Haitians, the immigrants, and not toward the fat cats who are making all the decisions, creating all of this problem. Like, it's so evident to me to look at this situation and see where the cogs are turning and how these things are happening. And to direct my animus, my anger, my malice, my discontent toward those people, the lawmakers, the people in power, the ruling class, where, I don't know, man, it just seems so easy for other working class people to turn sideways and not look up, to turn their anger to their left and not above them. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think that's a fucking fantastic example, because you'll notice that in the media, all of the management is saying, like, these are really wonderful workers, always on time, hardworking, etc. It's like, I don't know, it goes back to...
We delineate value based on productivity.
Right. Well, it's not even that, but it's like the management is always laudatory, you know? What is frustrating to me is that's like the counter to the argument. You know what I mean? It's like, oh, we're being racist towards Haitian immigrants, but look how good of a worker they are.
Yeah.
Look how wonderfully exploitable they are as labor, right? It feels like that same kind of opportunism, where it's like, no, don't be racist. Look, they're perfectly exploitable labor. They're fantastic workers. It's like, to everybody else seeing that, they're like, yeah, I agree. We should rally against racism. But at the same time, it's reinforcing that same kind of exploitation,
Yeah, it's just so easy to see working people divided. I mean, I will say, I knew who Ida B. Wells was.
Yeah.
But she was much more based and much more of a baller than I knew previously.
This just really cracked me up on page 170. They were definitely lesbians, right?
Oh, yeah.
They were,
I know exactly what you're talking about.
They were definitely 100% more than close friends,
Yeah.
I think, if you...
My margin note literally says, just say they're lesbians. It's fine.
Sorry, it's not even Ida B. Wells, dude. I'm fucking up. No more encircled by your love in this sad place. Yeah, we were close friends.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I will say that I really do appreciate just the name drops. When she goes into the chapter on communist women and she's just like, here are these women that you might not even know about.
Yeah.
Today it's easy to be like, oh, I know about this figure because I read about them on Wikipedia or whatever. Like I clicked the blue link. But, in 1981, it would be much harder to even find this information. So really appreciative of that kind of stuff. On top of that, man, in the abortion chapter, she includes abortion recipes, or preventative lotion, I should say.
Yeah.
But that's fucking sick. That's sick as hell.
Yeah, that's straight up agitprop stuff. And that's the way this stuff was disseminated previously and will soon be again.
It's the magnitude of this book, I think, because it is clearly an academic work, but she does not sneak it in there. Let me be clear about that.
It's quite overt.
She's plain, but this is an academic piece, right? You might read this for a lecture or something, right? I think that there's something to that. I don't know. I'm thinking about the anti-intellectual current and all that.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's like, what's the line between academic and activist, right?
That's an interesting question.
Well, just because I think Angela Davis is a great example. This is not going to be an Angela Davis slander episode, no doubt. Okay, but I think that she was simply too academic and not activist enough. See, that's the trap. That's the trap. But I think that her focus on the academy led to where she is today. And I even read a quote where she said that she gave up the fight too quickly.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I will fully acknowledge that my understanding of the history of her activism is incomplete at best. But from the vantage that I stand, it seems like she became so focused on prison abolition that all other things kind of fell to the wayside. And we said we weren't going to make this an anti-Angela Davis episode.
This will be the only thing.
We're not going to talk shit about her or anything. But back to your point about opportunism,
I was just about to say it, man.
Once you have such a singular closed focus, it becomes easy to get in bed with folks that you would otherwise wouldn't have. And, I understand why that might be strategically useful in a given time, but we die by inches oftentimes. These movements are often killed by inches, so to speak. And I think we have made many a comment about her standing on stage with Hillary Clinton and how that doesn't sit right with us. And I think maybe that's, at the root of where it comes from.
Yeah.
Editor Aaron here, I feel compelled to jump in and say that this is exactly the point that Angela Davis was making in the book about the women's suffrage movement, that white suffragettes were too quick to capitulate to white politicians in the South and throw black women under the bus, seeing only the kind of myopic goal of women's suffrage in the near future, not recognizing that, like we had said before, they were being opportunist and kind of shooting themselves in their own foot, not recognizing that by doing so, they were perpetuating the same sort of male supremacy that was ultimately going to be their downfall. Anyway, just wanted to throw that in there. Back to the show!
I think that the opportunism does really speak because it's the same thing, There is a pragmatic goal in sight, right? Prison abolition, that's something that could be accomplished.
Yeah, and it's something worthy of effort. Yeah.
Absolutely, and it is still a lofty goal. It's just that, that singular focus really grayed out everything else. And maybe that's not fair to say, but practically, yeah.
Yeah, but the question about where is the line between activist and academic or whatever, I think the deeper you put your foot in one, the more you're making it impossible for you to maintain the other. And
oh, surely in academia. I mean, Michael Parenti, right? He was too boisterous, and they blackballed him.
Yeah.
That's it.
It's tough. And the other thing that I think about a lot when I think about Angela Davis as an entity, as a person, as an identity in the public consciousness, is that I don't know that we have many or any real radical public figures anymore.
Right.
I think I talk all the time about how much I love Fred Hampton and what a great orator he was. Malcolm X, another great orator. Elaine Brown was a great orator, but everyone I'm talking about died 50 years ago.
Big question on my mind.
Left the public sphere 50 years ago,
I called it the last of the old guard in the intro, man, and that's just always a question on my mind. What happened, And Carissa laughs when I ask this question because she knows the answer is half of them died, half of them gave up, And
they were put in prison, they were killed, or they didn't want to be put in prison or killed.
Yeah. That's totally fair.
Yeah.
It will break me to accept that. That's the thing. Is I cannot accept that. Okay?
Yeah,
Simple.
I get that.
I have to believe that some of that fervor, some of that hope, some of that optimism still exists today. And it's where are these people? Now, of course, I realize that those people are 80 years old today.
Yeah.
But even thinking about the vacuum of left action in between, especially after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, right? The 90s, the 2000s, with the exception of Occupy, and the 10s, it's a fucking vacuum. It's a fucking vacuum.
Yeah, I guess what that really speaks to is the efficacy of the state apparatus's dismantling of all leftist organization.
Yeah.
The dissolution of the Black Panther Party really did a number on getting any real movement of the next guard moving forward. And, I came of age. I became politically aware around the turn of the century, really, when I was a teenager. And the WTO protests were big, but that was primarily all liberals.
We've talked before about the humongous anti-Iraq war protests.
Yeah.
What happened? We killed millions of people in Iraq.
Yeah.
After that, I mean.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Where is the movement?
Yeah. Well, there's something to be said about there are no public radical figures because of the efficacy of the machine, you can see people start to peek through, but even they have to tread a line. I think of Hassan,
Yeah.
Probably the most effective figure for propagating leftist beliefs right now.
Yeah, probably. And most people don't know who he is.
Right.
Also, this is another weird little side note, but it really bugs me that you have to be good looking to be a public figure.
We've talked before about how communists are losers. It doesn't help us out, right? And that's not a critique of communists. I also am happily a loser, right?
How much of the game do you have to play in order to even get your foot in the door is the kind of thing that really bothers me.
Yeah.
Hassan's a beautiful dude. I get it. Why people want to hang out and watch his streams or whatever, but it's lame.
A gorgeous and well-toned hunk who's also a deep Leninist.
Yeah. The only kind.
Right. Again, that's probably the most effective figure right now at creating this kind of consciousness. It sure ain't the people with 1,000 followers that I keep up with on TikTok.
Yeah, same.
Those guys are there for me and my algorithm, essentially.
Well, and I think maybe speaking to that, the way that the internet was, the free internet never came to pass, and it became more and more kind of gatekept by a particular number of capitalist oligarchs or whatever, has changed the way we interact in the public sphere. So we know who these figures are because the algorithm feeds them to us, because it's designed to do that so they can avoid any sort of anti-free speech opposition. They're like, everyone has a right to say what they're going to say on the platform or whatever, but the algorithm only feeds it to particular people. So it creates this kind of space where we are all living in one giant ecosphere, but within that same ecosphere of the internet are all these tiny little pockets that exist separate from one another. So the figures that are important to me on TikTok or whatever, they've got 1,000 followers. Sure. They don't speak to most people.
Yeah. I love the idea of the free internet because it's like that freedom of thought is actually more encapsulating than anything. It's I can just fuck off to my echo chamber if I need to.
Yeah.
And it's like a corralling effect. It's also pretty cooling when it comes to actual activism because you can just spend all your time debating online and feel fulfilled because you won the argument. and then nothing actually happens, you know?
Yeah.
And like, I mean, that even happens for people like Hassan, you know? I see him all the time on different platforms, and it's like, I know he is doing stuff other than this, but your full focus is media, right? It's messaging, it's communications.
Yeah.
You know, and that is valuable. That is an important aspect, right? Ugopnik talks about the funnel, and he thinks of his kind of milieu as the propagandists, you know? But not everybody can be a propagandist, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Which, hugely ironic coming from this space, but the internet is so cooling because it makes everyone into a propagandist.
You need the public-facing side, and you need the private militarized side.
Yes, and another private militarized that's all TikTok comment warriors, you know? That's our illegal activity, breaking Twitter's terms of service. Yeah, revolution now!
The closing chapter of the book is really fascinating because it's talking about the approach. It's called The Approaching Obsolescence of Housework, a Working Class Perspective.
Yeah.
And I think it's some of Davis's most prescient, useful analysis in the book.
Sure.
I don't really know where to start.
I think here's a great one on 223. There is a real possibility of radically transforming the nature of housework. She talks about, this isn't the quote, but she talks about socialized housework.
Yeah.
And it's twofold. First, it's obviously a deep look at housework, chores as an extension of the oppression of women.
Yeah,
right?
male supremacy.
Yeah. But I also think she brings it up as a shocking example. You know, she's like, if you want to be really radical, if you want to talk about changing the means of production, the modes of production, like here is something that we mostly take for granted that is totally oppressing us. And there is a clear solution, right? She's saying we could eliminate all of this with teams of trained and well-paid workers moving from dwelling to dwelling, engineering technologically advanced cleaning machinery that could swiftly and efficiently accomplish what the present-day housewife does so arduously and primitively,
Yep.
right? And I think that she gives this example because it's almost farcical, right? For the average person, I mean, you know, we just have a bunch of, like a labor force of cleaners that moves from house to house. You know, immediately your brain's like, all of these problems, you know, do I want all these people in my house, a million things, you know? But it's that jarring moment of realizing that, like, there is another possibility to this. We don't have to accept the oppression of housework,
Yeah.
you know?
Let me see if I can put all of these thoughts that I'm having together into something coherent. First of all, housework encapsulates two intersections of marginalization that she outlines through the history of the book. First is the patriarchal male supremacist attitude toward femininity and how it has been transformed socially over time into the housewife.
Yeah.
So this kind of menial work, menial from the perspective of a patriarchal male supremacist, menial work that is relegated to femininity and thus equated with femininity. So there's one element there. But the other side of it is that as capitalism has continued to flourish over the last couple of hundred years in the United States, more and more women are being forced into the labor force.
Yeah.
And now there's a tension within that concept of femininity and the concept of women entering the workforce because you can't do both. And she mentions on 223 at the very bottom, nonetheless, the rapid expansion of the female labor force means that more and more women are finding it increasingly difficult to excel as housewives according to the traditional standards.
Which, mind you, the traditional standard is a construction, right?
Yeah, it's a 100-year-old construction
Yeah.
at the time of this writing.
Yeah, I love when she talks about the colonial woman and all of their roles. I mean, like, this is too cliche, but they're not house workers. They are literally house makers, you know?
Yeah.
Like, they are doing the production that is necessary for the survival of the home.
Yeah, every piece of clothing, woven and stitched, every candle.
Died.
Yeah, and the stuff that we now probably equate with, quote, housework was stuff that was so unimportant that it wasn't even
Yeah.
qualified.
They,
you know?
they say, you know, she says that the washing is done once a month. Spring
Spring
cleaning.
cleaning.
Spring cleaning.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah. So there's that. And I think that that's really interesting. So I think that housework is a really interesting place to focus one's analysis because it really hones in on this very unique intersection of class exploitation and sexist exploitation.
Yeah.
Something else that I think is really interesting. I was thinking a lot while reading this chapter about those dudes, those fathers who say shit like, I'm babysitting my kids. Bitch, They're your kids. You're not babysitting them. That's part of the labor of being a parent.
Yeah.
And I don't know, just so many things like at the bottom of 222, she's talking about men's view of household chores as women's work. She says, how many of them would not characterize their household cleaning activities as helping their women partners?
Helping out around the house, you know? It's like, no, man.
Fucking nonsense.
You know, it's not even like this crazy notion of, step back from the utopian ideal for a second. You know, you could just divide up the housework equitably. You know, Carissa does all the laundry and I do all the dishes, period. I don't touch the laundry. She doesn't touch the dishes. And that's perfectly acceptable.
Yeah. Whatever arrangement people make is fine as long as it's an arrangement that they consent to. You know what I mean? The other thing I just remembered, the other thing I was thinking of was back to when we read about the Paris Commune.
Right.
Because like this idea of communal meal preparation was a big part of what was happening there.
They had to.
But I mean, like, it makes sense and it's proven to work, a socialized approach to quote unquote, what does she call it?
Another communist advocating for bread lines.
Work that is neither stimulating, creative, nor productive, right? Like, making food is not always stimulating, creative, or productive, but it is necessary. It is a form of labor that is necessary for our subsistence. And so that is a perfect candidate of the type of labor that can and should be socialized so as to ease the burden on a community as a whole.
Right.
And the Paris Commune was a perfect example of that.
You know what? Not related to our conversation on the book, but it just reminds me of that work that we were just talking about earlier, where it's like, this has to be done, and I'm fucking dreading it, you know? Yeah. Well, she even quotes a woman saying, like, sometimes I just feel like I have to do the housework because I'm at the house, you know?
Yeah.
It's a fucking prison, man.
A Simpsons analogy, as I am often wont to do, when they move, when Homer gets a job working for Hank Scorpio, the greatest single episode guest star in The Simpsons history, and they move to another town, Marge, as a housewife, goes into this house and all of the cleaning is fully automated in the house. There are like machines that do all of the cleaning, waters the garden, makes all the food. And she like starts drinking because she doesn't know what to do.
I was just going to say, all of these housewives were fucking too busy being addicted to Klonopin or some shit, you know?
This is the story arc of Betty Draper in the first 2 seasons of Mad Men. Also, by the way, she is becoming anxious and depressed because she's been promised a life that she was going to find fulfillment as a wife, as a mother. And she's living that, and she's like, this fucking sucks.
Yeah. Dude, yeah, man. Well, she also makes a really interesting critique of a movement that I wasn't actually familiar with, the wages for housework movement. And you know what it actually made me think of a lot was UBI, Universal Basic Income.
Yeah.
She makes a really great argument against it because she says, like, would a wage like, I understand the argument for wages for housework because, you know, you're saying this is labor, obviously, let's get paid for it, let's get compensated for it. But, you know, would a wage get rid of that prison? You know, would a wage get rid of those cage bars or whatever? And it makes me think of universal basic income because a couple of years ago, in 2016, I was really cavalier about that.
Are you a Yang Gang?
Sidebar, fuck no. Fuck no. No, but I saw the writing on the wall as far as the new standards of labor that will come with automation, you know? Like, I was more than happy to say, like, we're heading towards fucking dog shit dystopia, even more so than we are currently in. There needs to be something in place. UBI presented itself as a viable option. But this argument in this book actually kind of brought me away from that feeling. I've been away from that feeling for a while, but it brought me more so away from that feeling because it's almost like a complete alienation from your labor. I am paying you, and in return, you will go and use your labor somehow, right? It's something about that is almost so fucked up, and I didn't see it before, and I'm only really seeing it now. Something about that.
The reason I think UBI is a worthwhile concept is because nothing else is socialized and given to us. If housing and healthcare were provided to us, I don't know that UBI is as relevant as a thing anymore. You know what I mean? Because I like the idea of a model where your basic needs are met, and then if you want other stuff, that's where you feel compelled to
the Nordic model.
Yeah,
right?
Yes.
The Nordic model.
I don't know. Yeah.
Well, you know, and something to say about that, this is getting away from the book a little bit, but like I heard a really poignant argument against the Nordic model, against European social democracy, and it's because the existence of those models is predicated on the oppression of the rest of the world via the U.S. You know, those countries don't have to worry about military spending because they have U.S. military bases all over the place. The U.S. is maintaining the violent hegemony. They're allowed to do their fun, fancy, and free social democracy up in the north. You know what I mean? It's like the violence is still in the picture in social democracy. It's just shifted elsewhere globally.
That's valid.
They're still totally reliant on the exploitation of the global south, and that's reinforced by our military domination, the U.S. military domination.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a real hit against social democracy for me,
Yeah.
Because people are like, why can't we just be like Sweden? Why can't we just be like Norway? It's because we're busy policing the rest of the world for Norway and Sweden. Not Norway and Sweden specifically, but, I'm even just like center-left countries in Europe. And I think that this is way far off, but I think that that's a big part of the hesitance to detach themselves from the U.S. is because they know it will bring a particular instability to their system that they then have to reckon with in a way that they have not had to for hundreds of years.
That's valid.
It's the cavalcade of quotes.
Yes, the cavalcade. We're going to have an extended cavalcade here because there are quite a lot of quotes in this text that merit discussion, even if we don't want to devote an entire time just to talking about the history that's being discussed. I'm going to start on page 18.
Sure.
She's talking here again about the life of enslaved Africans. She says what she's talking about is that due to the nature of slavery, domestic labor within the slave quarters was significantly different.
Yeah.
And I really like the way that she distinguishes that. She says the salient theme emerging from domestic life in the slave quarters is one of sexual equality.
Yeah.
The labor that slaves performed for their own sake and not for the aggrandizement of their masters was carried out on terms of equality. They transformed that negative equality which emanated from the equal oppression they suffered as slaves into a positive equality, the egalitarianism characterizing their social relations. I really love that characterization as a metamorphosis from equal oppression to equal freedom.
Yeah.
And I think that's really, really poignant.
Yeah, she makes it very clear right away that it's like, under slavery, they didn't give a fuck about your gender. Even on page 5, it would seem, therefore, the starting point for any exploration of black women's lives under slavery would be an appraisal of their role of workers, right? Women, no less than men, were viewed as profitable labor units. They might as well have been genderless as far as slaveholders were concerned.
Yep. The slave woman was first a full-time worker for her owner and only incidentally a wife, mother, and homemaker.
Yeah. Man, this is a big theme that is tangential to this conversation, but so much stuff is a fucking legacy of slavery, man.
Yeah.
It's brutal, brutal, brutal. Things that you would never think of. I just thinking of that Malcolm X quote again. It's like, you haven't even pulled out the blade, and you're asking us to heal the wound.
Yeah.
There's so much stuff that stems from 300 years of chattel slavery, man. How the fuck are we going to try to say we're done with it? We're post-racial. Like, it's crazy.
Something so transformative to every social norm, and then taking it away, supposedly, taking it away, and then pretending as though it never existed somehow is going to return everything to the original social form. It's bonkers that we've just decided that, like, just keep walking, keep moving away from it, and it'll all fix itself.
Right.
Somehow, as though every fucking institution wasn't completely transformed by it, is just insane.
Yeah. I do love how she ends chapter 1, the standards for new womanhood. She's talking about the resistance of slave women and the kind of fortitude that cultivated. I just love how she ends it. It was those women who passed on their nominally free female descendants a legacy of hard work, perseverance, and self-reliance, a legacy of tenacity, resistance, and insistence on sexual equality. In short, a legacy spelling out standards for new womanhood. Yep. It just makes me think of that feminine ideal again. It's like, what womanhood are you protecting? You, woman, are allowed, believe it or not, to define womanhood however you would like it. You are the person doing it.
Yeah.
So why are you accepting this 150-year-old, male-focused, patriarchal, sexist, and racist definition? Why can't you go and create your own new womanhood, right? I mean, that's like the whole women's liberation thing. It's like, you are you could do whatever. You could do anything. You're not confined by the restraints of sexuality. But to then, after all of that liberation, to turn back and say, we actually need to protect womanhood. And by that, I mean a very essential set of standards.
Yeah.
That's fucked up. I don't know. It's short-sighted. I don't know. There's something really aggravating about it.
Yeah, for sure.
I love on 34 when she talks about all the early feminist movements were saying marriage is slavery, and then she says that, they made the mistake of equating those things because in reality what they're saying is not that marriage is as bad as slavery, but slavery is only as bad as marriage, really. Or I love on 61, man, there's actually so many good quotes in this. I'm actually going to go to 56 first. She's quoting Charlotte Woodward here. I do not believe that there was any community in which the souls of some women were not beating their wings for rebellion. I also love on 61, she does a retort against the Christian argument there. You know, it's like, if you're saying that Christ was a man, so men should have dominance, she goes, Christ wasn't a woman, but where did Christ come from? That's right. From God and a woman. Man had nothing to do with him. Man wasn't even in the equation, man. That's funny to me.
Yeah, that was one of the arguments of Sojourner Truth. There's a lot of really good stuff around that. And actually on 59, the story about Frederick Douglass's daughter stood out to me. After her official admission to a girls' seminary in Rochester, New York, Douglass's daughter was formally prohibited from attending classes with the white girls. The principal who issued the order was an abolitionist woman. One objection would suffice to continue the exclusion. After the white girls voted in favor of integrating the classroom, the principal approached the girls' parents, using the one resulting objection as an excuse to exclude Douglass's daughter. So, white liberal women at it again.
Yeah.
Frederick Douglass's daughter denied integration by an abolitionist.
Yeah.
Just fucking wild.
Man, white feminism. And it's like, I'm also aware of the flip side of that, too, where it's like, you can just be misogynist as long as you put white in front of woman. But yeah, no, just the cognitive dissonance, man. I mean, like, even in the first chapter when she's talking about the horrid, ghoulish ways that they beat slave women, and then they're like, and this was from a good Christian family, you know?
Yeah.
It's like, yeah, what the fuck, man? I mean, there's examples of the way they treat slaves in this where I just had to pause for a second and just be like, my God. I mean, you know, she talks about they box up a woman in a barrel and drive nails through it and roll her down a hill. What the fuck, man?
Yeah.
What the fuck?
Yeah, since I flipped back here to chapter 1 on page 7, her description, this was something that I didn't know to this level of detail. Her description of enslaved women as, quote, breeders. They were called breeders. The ideological exaltation of motherhood, as popular as it was during the 19th century, did not extend to slaves. In the eyes of the slaveholders, slave women were not mothers at all. They were simply instruments guaranteeing the growth of the slave labor force. They were breeders, animals whose monetary value could be precisely calculated in terms of their ability to multiply their numbers.
Yeah.
Just complete dehumanization. Really fucking gross. I didn't know the term breeders in this context before.
Yeah, I actually saw a big debate maybe half a year ago about whether there were plantations specifically made for breeding, and my takeaway from it was like every plantation was specifically made for breeding if you really fucking think about it that hard. You know, I don't know. Yeah, and I love the way that she describes, like, yeah, they are aware of the value of the women, but as you would treat a fucking horse with a colt, you know, like is that right? Or like a cow with a calf, I guess is the better.
Yeah, she says calves and cows.
Yeah, there you go. So it's just fucked up, man.
Yeah. I don't know if I want to open this door. Fuck it. I'm going to do it. I have made an argument for a very long time that veganism is an intersection of feminism. And I get a lot of pushback from feminists about that.
Sure.
And I get a lot of rhetoric thrown at me when I talk about it in that way, as though I am equating women to animals and that's a misogynistic attitude. First of all, I make no distinction in that way. All humans are animals. There are human animals and non-human animals. That's the distinction that needs to be made.
It's not that we're bringing the woman down to the level of the animal, but we're lifting the animal to the... Well, hold on.
Well, listen. I mean, so this description of breeders and the fact that Angela Davis calls to analogy of calves and cows is apt for more than one reason. This is the way dairy farms operate. Yeah. The forced insemination, the forced impregnation of female dairy calves, and then the stealing of their children, their calves, days after birth. I don't see how you can recognize the inhumanity in one action and not recognize the inhumanity in another. Yeah. And I think it's pretty fucked up.
Well, she also references the way that they would use women in the place of draft horses, right? Of draft animals. Yeah. What was it? What did she say? The value of the woman, or the value of the animal is known, but the value of the woman is flexible, or something along those lines?
Yeah, she makes some flippant comment like that.
Yeah. We were talking earlier about, like, marginalized people that go unseen. Maybe that's the most unseen, you know?
Yeah, I mean, you'll hear a lot of vegan activists talk about that, about, you know, if you want to stand against oppression and marginalization, literally the largest marginalized oppressed group on the planet you have control over the way that
Yeah.
you deal with those.
Oh gosh! Every time we do the veganism conversation, I want to like push against the boundaries because I want to know, like I'm curious where
Sure.
the discussion goes, but I just know it's going to end up with the same, yeah. Because we've had this conversation exactly where it's
Yeah.
like, at what point are you defining an animal's labor as labor in the same way you would define a human's labor, right? If that animal had completely free will, what would they do with that labor, so to speak? I'd survive, I guess, right?
Subsistence,
But they
yeah.
wouldn't do it in the same way that human labor does because maybe this is an extension of capital, actually, is that our labor is different, as in it is transformative of nature in a way that creates more value than what was originally there, whereas an animal's labor maybe doesn't do the same.
Well, yeah, sure. But I mean, it's not about labor as much as it's about bodily autonomy. That's why even Angela Davis went vegan. But I think the relevant point in this context, though, is that most of those animals wouldn't exist if
Yes.
it weren't for the industrialization of factory farming. So, like, they're bred into existence
Yeah.
to be exploited. If we didn't breed them into existence...
Yeah. It's another problem that's grown so large to become epidemic as to defy solutions. Interesting.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a good way to bring it back.
Right.
Maybe I'll pivot to another thing here. I don't really want to spend the whole episode talking about rape and sexual assault not because it's doesn't merit
Yeah.
conversation and analysis, because it is an epidemic problem. It continues to be, but also it's not the most fun thing to sit around and listen to. But literally on the same page, Davis talks about rape as a weapon of the slave owner. She says rape was in fact an uncamouflaged expression of the slaveholder's economic mastery and the overseer's control over black women as workers. Yeah. There is still a vegan connection there, but I would mention further back in the chapter about sexual assault, another thing I wanted to point out, and something that I think is often omitted from this conversation, on 183.
Okay.
The reliance on rape as an instrument of white supremacist terror predates by several centuries the institution of lynching. Slave owners were reluctant to destroy their valuable property. Rape was a terribly efficient method of keeping black women and men alike in check. And I think it's worth mentioning, I'm not trying to pivot and refocus the conversation of rape to talk about the sexual assault of men, but
Surely.
the rape of enslaved men is often ignored and overlooked, and was in the very same way used as a weapon by slave owners against the enslaved.
Yeah.
In a way that I think I was happy that she at least had a passing mention of.
Certainly, yes. Yes, I absolutely agree with you. It's not that we're trying to refocus the conversation of sexual assault to be about, but men also.
Yeah.
But it's like, that goes completely, most of the time, ignored.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And again, I don't want to perpetuate the invisibility of one form of marginalization just for the sake of focusing on another.
Yeah.
Both existed. Both are worthy of conversation.
Surely.
Moving on.
The only criticism she has of Douglas is his focus on the ballot as the measure of power. I really appreciated that.
Yeah, it got me thinking a lot about left-wing communism.
Yeah.
Our episode and our conversation around that.
Yeah. I'm not fucking voting for the Democrats again, man. That's a goddamn guarantee. I mean, that should go without being said, but, it's just the case. It's just in the historical context, right? I really appreciate the way that she separates the women's argument for suffrage versus the movement for the 14th and 15th Amendments, because Frederick Douglass viewed it as a necessary means of survival. It's like, this isn't just a tool that we can use to express our voice. It's like the literal means for us to prevent death, to prevent our destruction. And like, I get that. It's just that it's now 200 years later, I think we can stop having this discussion about the efficiency of the ballot, maybe.
Yeah.
She does talk about U.S. imperialism a little bit, both in the 1900s in our invasion of the Philippines. How fucking racist were they in the 1900s, man? The quotes from both Roosevelts in here were frankly quite shocking. I knew Teddy Roosevelt was a piece of shit already.
Yeah.
But even FDR calling for sterilization, that's another huge topic that we haven't touched
didn't
on
really
yet.
talk about, yeah.
But fuck every U.S. president, I guess, at the end of the day.
Yeah.
At the end of the
At
day.
the end of the day.
But they talk about Vietnam. To double back on that point about the
Rape as a
ricochet.
weapon.
Yes,
Also,
yeah,
yeah.
rape as a weapon, but also that ricochet effect, right? Because it was drummed into the heads of U.S. soldiers that they were fighting an inferior race, they could be taught that raping Vietnamese women was a necessary military duty. They could be instructed to search women with their penises. To what extent did those brutal experiences affect their attitudes towards women in general? While it would be quite erroneous to single out Vietnam veterans as the main perpetrators of sexual crimes, there can be little doubt that the horrendous repercussions of the Vietnam experience are still being felt by all women in the United States today.
Yeah.
I mean, even to give a more modern example, think about all the fucking CTE fucking soldiers returning from Iraq, man. I mean, I can't imagine that they have very nice views on women.
It's just like the conversation about slavery. Like, how can you reform someone's ideology so strongly and then just say, like, well, it's not that anymore, so go about your merry way, and expect them to have a complete 180 shift in their attitude?
Yeah. I didn't write it down, but I love that quote where, maybe it's Frederick Douglass, where he says, like, a war is much harder to end than you think, a civil war twice as hard. You know, because it's like the war is not really over.
Yeah.
You know, there are still remnants of the war that are with us.
Yeah.
That's veterans, especially.
I wanted to call out Angelina Grimke for
Yeah.
being based on page 68. We get this long block quote from her, but she's talking about the, quote, second revolution, talking about women's liberation. The war is not, as the South falsely pretends, a war of races, nor of sections, nor of political parties, but a war of principles, a war upon the working classes, whether white or black. In this war, the black man was the first victim, the working man of whatever color the next, and now all who contend for the rights of labor, for free speech, free schools, free suffrage, and a free government. So one of the rare examples of someone that did recognize the intersections of these forms of oppression at the time, and was championing the liberation of all.
Yeah, I even love when she drops the Marx quote, right? Labor in white skin can never be free as long as labor in black skin is branded.
Yep.
You know, Marx wasn't a fucking racist, y'all. Come on. We knew this.
I think ideologically he wasn't a racist.
Okay, asterisk. We've had this conversation already. You can refer to our episode. No, I'm just kidding. I love, this is not anything we could really talk about, but I just love the quote, you know, if I owned both hell and Texas, I'd rent out Texas and live in hell.
Yeah.
Fucking hell, man. What a turn of phrase that is.
Just another based quote from an escaped enslaved woman, Margaret Garner. Davis calls upon her story a couple of times in the book, who was an escaped enslaved woman left with her daughter and then ended up killing her daughter when they were being captured, shortly before being captured. And Margaret Garner said, now she would never know what a woman suffers as a slave. And the line that I liked a lot, Margaret Garner says, I will go singing to the gallows rather than be returned to slavery.
Yeah.
That kind of strength of will, of determination is just so commendable.
Yeah. You know, it's wrapped up in the whole discussion on abortion, which we didn't really touch on all that much, but another legacy of slavery, man. Another legacy of racism. I love that she talks about the progressive potential in the birth control movement.
Yeah.
And it's like, yeah, there is progressive potential there, but you can see very quickly how it becomes something that's reactionary and reinforcing. Sterilization, I mean, maybe now's not a bad time to talk about it, but like the statistics on sterilization in this book will make you look twice, man. It's fucked up, okay? Especially, I mean, African Americans aside, you know, when she talks about 1 in 4 Native American women had been sterilized, you know, or that quote that was like, if we
against their knowledge, they were all going to that one hospital and they were being sterilized without
or the
consent. Guy
that's like, if you want me to deliver your children, you have to agree to be sterilized after 2 things. He was the only OB in the fucking I'm getting a little heated here. But it's like, if we kept this rate of sterilization up in Puerto Rico, the population would be gone in 10 to 20 years. It's like, we're just doing another successful genocide here, man. Yeah. And there is a progressive potential in that kind of thing, involuntary motherhood, all these things that Angela Davis talks about. But you just really have to be cognizant of that reaction, of reactionary potential, you know?
Yep.
I love on 207, another quote from somebody else. This is Grimke again. She says, if wives and husbands alternatively agreed to give birth to their children, no family would ever have more than 3, the husband bearing 1 and the wife 2.
Yeah.
That's so fucking funny, you know? The wife has a kid, the husband has a kid, the wife has 1, and then the husband goes, I think 3 is enough. I don't think I want to go through that again.
We're good. Yeah.
So good.
It just occurred to me, flipping through the pages here, there was a quote around that Indian Health Services Hospital on 218 that really jumped out to me about sterilization as well. Because this is at the end of that first full paragraph. She says, is it possible that the record of the Nazis throughout the years of their reign may have been almost equaled by U.S. government-funded sterilizations in the space of a single year?
Wow. I had missed that in the space of a single year.
Yeah.
The statistic she's referencing is right above. 100,000 and 200,000 sterilizations funded that year by the federal government. During Hitler's Germany, 250,000 sterilizations were carried out by the Nazis' hereditary health law, right? Yeah. I had missed the fact that it was in a single year. Yeah.
Bonkers.
Absolutely fucked up.
Yeah, totally fucked. On 105, something that I'm noticing a lot while reading all of these texts that are a little bit older in history anytime they reference work from children, I'm always reminded of the sad state of education today. We get some answers from children on this page. The question, this is from Cincinnati, by the way. The question is, what do you think most about? Children furnished these answers. A first grader, we are going to be good boys, and when we get a man to get the poor slaves from bondage, and I am sorrow to hear that the boat of Tiskilwa went down with 200 poor slaves. It grieves my heart so that I could faint in 1 minute. That's a 7-year-old child that said that. And then a 10-year-old. This is to inform you that I have 2 cousins in slavery who are entitled to their freedom. They have done everything that the will requires, and now they won't let them go. They talk of selling them down the river. If this was your case, what would you do? I wish I could get sentences that are that articulate from fucking 11th graders today. You know, it's real fucking sorry, sad state.
What I'm looking for right now on 121, this is what that really evoked in my mind. Okay. Bourgeois ideology, and particularly its racist ingredients, must really possess the power of dissolving real images of terror into obscurity and insignificance, right? To think about that first child, talking about their heart is breaking, thinking about the slave ship going down, okay? Every U.S. child has seen the image, right, the diagram of all of the slaves packed into the ship. I know it, right? Everybody's seen it, okay? That should evoke real anger. Right? That should evoke a serious reflection on our history, okay? But it doesn't. It's a picture in a textbook that everyone sees and they glaze over, right?
Yeah.
The gravity of all of this history is serious and it should change your mind. It's just that the power of dissolving those images of terror into obscurity and insignificance is so strong, man. I mean, that's that topic, the reticence of learning about racism, man.
Yeah, I think something I was thinking about a lot while reading it that we talked a little bit off mic about is the kind of double-edged sword of learning about racism, especially as like a BIPOC kid or something like that, because the history is so important and so relevant, and if you want to do anything in any way to move forward, you have to understand the historical implications of every system that is still in place today. Yeah. That is quite a weight to bear, though. That's quite a burden to carry on one's shoulders. And frankly, the way that the U.S. education system teaches black kids about the history of the United States is one that basically is like black folks were enslaved and then they weren't, and then Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X fought about it, and now everyone has civil rights. And the only literature they're ever exposed to is literature about the slave narrative, and it's really fucking tiring. Yeah. To live in a world where you're told your only history is that of enslavement.
Yeah. Well, not only that, is that it's taught as history, when in reality it's still applicable today.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. I don't know what my comment on it is. I other than like, I don't know what the balance is. Yeah. I don't know what the appropriate balance is.
What is it going to require to fix that problem?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's a totally relevant conversation. Thinking about something like the 1619 Project, I've heard real criticisms of it, that it's maybe too focused in the wrong direction. And it's really just back to that question, like, right, how do you walk that fine line between the two? Because it does have to be acknowledged, but in a way that isn't isolating, you know? It isn't like, it's not just history, right? It has to be wrapped into, well, honestly, you know what I think it is, man, is a sense of powerlessness.
There's a fatalism that comes along with that education, yeah.
Yeah, it's like the goal of us learning all of this history is to apply it. Right? The goal of those children learning those history is to pass a test. There's not a connection of that history to actual movement today, to actual real change, to action.
Yeah.
You know, and I think that alone maybe could make some real bounds towards progress if we're able to connect that history to like real shit today. And the education system just doesn't do that.
Yeah, it's very passive also. I think the education, by and large, requires students to be taught, not to become educated. And so, you know, what's complicated about it is that education is the cornerstone of every liberatory project ever. Yeah. But to become educated requires active participation at the very least, buy-in and determination and desire to do something with that education. And the U.S. educational system is set up specifically to squeeze that desire out of children, to grind it out of kids.
Yeah. And then they wonder why they're, you know, so uncurious, so unquestioning.
Yeah.
It's like, by third grade, you've taught them to stop.
Yeah.
To stop questioning you, to accept what you're saying as the teacher.
I mean, we have both previously been teachers. Most of what we talk about in our experience in the classroom gets cut out of these episodes. But I will say, like, I think my experience entering education was that I believed secondary education to be a pathway toward liberation.
Yeah.
I thought it was a liberatory project, and I wanted to participate in that. Effectively, I had teachers in my experience that opened just a sliver of a door to my curiosity and my interest in political struggles, and like gave me a book recommendation or something like that and got me moving in that direction. And I wanted to be that teacher for as many kids as I could be. And I don't think I was very successful in that. And I felt myself being beaten down and ground down by the system, the educational survival complex, as Bettina Love calls it, just as much as we're doing that to kids. And I think that's why we grind teachers out. We can't keep teachers. College students are not entering schools of education any longer. No one wants to be a teacher because they see that it sucks. Anyone that makes it into the classroom, almost everybody is out within the first 5 years. I managed to last 10 years, and I can't believe that I did that.
Listener, I only lasted 2, so...
And it's because the system is made like this.
Yeah.
And it fucking sucks.
Yeah, it's predicated on the goodwill of teachers, man. It's fucked up.
But yeah, it's just an extension of bourgeois ideology.
A little bit about the IWW in here. Not really anything that much, but I appreciate... I've been reading a little bit of that history of the CPUSA that I still have your copy of from Kites. And, I don't know, the IWW is a very interesting one. I have an autobiography of Big Bill Haywood I should probably read.
Yeah, and he gets brought up a couple of times in here, too.
He seems like a real cool motherfucker. All the IWW people are, man.
Yeah.
One big union. Interesting.
Something on 128.
Okay.
In this context, she's talking about black women in the club movement. That's the name of the chapter. And near the bottom of the page, she says, black women had been motivated less by considerations of charity or by general moral principles than by the palpable demands of their people's survival. The 1890s were the most difficult years for black people since the abolition of slavery, and women naturally felt obligated to join their people's resistance struggle. And that quote really got me thinking a lot about how to activate folks and how to get folks like you and I more involved in real liberatory projects.
Sure.
Because I feel like so many of us, and I can speak for myself saying that, like, I am very personally preoccupied literally with survival. It's a fucking fight to get through a lot of days.
Sure.
And so, like, I get so preoccupied with that to find energy to mobilize and do anything toward the liberation of myself and others feels almost so daunting.
Yeah.
I wonder with this quote where that call comes from, that call to action to know, to hear that clarion and say, like, this is for the survival of my people. This is necessary.
You know what's making me think about is the radicalizing moment. We don't need a moment to radicalize us because we already hold these beliefs. Maybe the radicalization is the surmounting of that obstacle. The needs of my liberation are greater than my want for survival. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Maybe that's what the real radicalization is that I have gotten to the point where I can throw some of these things which I before held to a point where it was immobilizing to the wind, and that's a that's a wide cavern, that can mean a lot of things. But what I'm saying is that, like, that's for better or for worse, Great, you're moving, but also, like, there's things that get cast off on the side process there. I don't know. It's just like, how do you strike that balance in the same way? But it just made me think of that radicalizing moment.
Yeah, and there's even a part of me that's like, in the context that Davis is presenting black women in the club movement here, they're literally fighting for their survival, for their survival of their people. But it doesn't even have to be that serious. How can we activate folks to do things just as an empathic response?
Yeah.
Like, we've decried mutual aid to a certain degree as an ameliorative response, but at the same time, like,
totally
how do we
necessary.
get more people just involved in something like that? It's not life or death for them, you know what I mean? But they're still doing something to get into their community, to do something good for their community, to do something good with their community. And that, to me, would be the open door to further radicalization.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be like you feel like your survival is on the line, so you jump into this organization. It should be like you move into this organization and you, through the work with that organization, realize your radicalization.
Sure. Well, I think that's where the propagandist comes into play, man, because the cultural lovers of control are so strong that that kind of sense, that mutual aid sense, has been drummed out of people, And my first thought was that there has to be some kind of material incentive, but that's an extension of bourgeois ideology.
Yeah.
It shouldn't be that way. And the fact that I'm thinking that way immediately just shows me how entrenched it is. That propagandistic kind of dissemination of ideas is actually what's pushing people closer to that principle of even mutual aid. It's just the fact that, like, That's the first step in this long process, and we need them to be like 10 steps down the line.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And I hate this line, but it's like just more fucking hard work. You know, it's just more boots on the ground shit, right? It's just more struggle against the machine, because ultimately the machine is what's controlling us, you know?
Yeah. I mean,
It's a tough question, because it's like, what do you do? There is something to be done. We know this.
Yeah.
But doing it is the problem, man.
We've already kind of talked about this a little bit when we were talking about opportunism, but another quote that kind of calls that to mind is on 112.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this is Susan B. Anthony that Davis is referring to. She says, the increasingly influential expediency argument proposed by Anthony and her colleagues was a feeble justification for the suffragists' indifference to the pressing requirements of the times. And I wrote in the margin, this feels like the age-old white feminist stance. Ignore the pressing issues to advance the greater cause. And I wrote, ICE detention, trans rights, animal liberation. These are all things that are in tandem to a real feminist movement, an intersectional feminist movement, but get ignored for the sake of girl boss feminism instead, you know, or whatever the fuck.
Oh, God. More female camp guards. Yeah. Or, you know, the fucking, maybe the next drone will be sent by a woman, you know, like all of those things. On page 113, the next page over, the ostensibly neutral stance is assumed by the leadership of NALSA, with respect to the color question, actually encouraged the proliferation of undisguised racist ideas within the ranks of the suffrage campaign.
Same sort of thing about like shooting yourself in the foot that we were talking about before. I also just wrote TERFs next to that because it's, again, the same ideology. You allow these things to percolate and proliferate within your movement. It's going to eat you from the inside.
It just makes me think of what she says about the obstacle course again. It's like you are literally having to jump through so many hurdles to justify your belief that you're throwing things to the side, right? And those things are people.
Yeah.
Those things are people.
Yeah.
Like,
the Communist Women chapter was really dope, but...
what is to say?
Yeah. Quote on 157 from the chapter about communist women. A couple of things here in the section about Mother Bloor. She's talking about pacifism, sort of, and that she says support for the war against fascism was the sole means of guaranteeing a meaningful peace. And then further down, we get a quote from Lulia Jackson, who says, we can't just give those bad capitalists their supper and put them to bed the way we do with our children. We must fight them. Mm-hmm. The most anti-war, anti-violent stance is to fucking kill all the fascists. Then you will have your peace.
Yeah.
There is no such thing as a peace through pacifism.
Oh, gosh. The reason I'm oh-godding right there is just because it's just kill this one group of people and then you'll have all your solutions, man.
Yeah, I suppose I could see why that would be a little alarming.
Right, because then what do you define as fascism, right?
Yeah.
What the fuck? No, this is not a totally belabored argument, of course. Yeah. Can I just say that Capitola Tasker is an objectively dope name? What the? That's sick as hell. Bring back way cool naming conventions.
Yeah. Fuck it. Let's call it there. I've only got a couple other random things.
Okay.
But... oh, no, I do want to call one more.
By all means.
Fuck it.
Fuck it!
On 175, one of racism's salient historical features has always been the assumption that white men, especially those who wield economic power, possess an incontestable right of access to black women's bodies. Slavery relied as much on routine sexual abuse as it relied on the whip and the lash. In other words, the right claimed by slave owners and their agents over the bodies of female slaves was a direct expression of their presumed property rights over black people as a whole. And that's a perfect encapsulation of what capitalism does to commodify women specifically. When the body is a commodity, capitalists feel entitled to it. And I just thought that that was a perfect encapsulation of the intersection of sexism and classism. And she's talking about it specifically through the lens of black women, enslaved Africans. And so it's a perfect example of how our understanding of capitalism and capitalist exploitation must be intersectional to be complete.
Yeah. The liberation of one is wrapped up in the liberation of all.
Exactly. And that's where I'll leave it.
Yeah. Word. What questions did this book leave you with, Aaron?
I had a couple of minor questions.
Sure.
Number one, something that I had a question while reading and then I looked up to answer.
Okay.
In the chapter Women's Suffrage at the Turn of the Century, The Rising Influence of Racism, she's talking about quote-unquote race riots in history. What she really means are race massacres perpetrated by white men. This is on 124. She mentions Springfield, Ohio, my hometown where I was born. I went to school in Springfield for my entire childhood. I had no idea about any race massacre in Springfield. In fact, there were two. In 1904 and 1905, if I remember correctly, a number of black men were killed. I think it was 40, up to 40 men killed.
Jesus.
Had never heard of that, didn't know about it. It was only because she mentions it in passing that I was like, what the fuck? And I looked it up.
Dude, it's that obscuration, the obscurative power of the system, man. I used to live on Auburn Avenue, which is literally was historically the Black Wall Street. Okay. And I didn't learn that fact until I lived there. I mean, a couple years back when the Watchmen show came out, the Tulsa Massacre became huge only because of one show. How many people knew about that before?
Yeah.
It's fucked up, dude. It's fucked up. I didn't mention the statistic earlier, but the rate of lynchings after the Civil War was insane, especially when she compares it to the lynchings before. I think she says in like the 2 decades before the Civil War, there were 300 lynchings. In the 30 years afterwards, there were 300 per year.
Yeah.
Okay? Per year. It was systemic, institutionalized.
Yeah.
I just wanted to mention that because that's a crazy statistic.
The one other question that I had, and maybe one more relevant to this project here, on 228.
Okay.
This is in the last chapter where she's talking about the obsolescence of housework. And she says, since housework does not generate profit, domestic labor was naturally defined as an inferior form of work as compared to capitalist wage labor. And going by her definitions here, housework is non-creative and non-productive, but we must acknowledge also that it is, to some degree, at least, still necessary and definitely still labor. So where is the valuation of that labor is my question. I'm going to keep this in my mind when we go into the capital, because I'm curious how we're making delineations of the forms of labor and how we value that labor. If it's, quote, non-productive labor, if it's not creating something after the fact. I think the same thing would be true of the service economy.
Sure. There's something interesting in the example she gives about the argument in which someone says that the work that a woman does, since it maintains the population, should be considered in the valuation. And the argument against that is that process is a precondition to labor production. Maybe it's in the same kind of sense, where like these necessary tasks are important for maybe like a beforehand kind of thing. I don't know. That is an interesting question, though.
Yeah. I don't expect we have a rhetorical answer to it at this point, but it's something that the book raised for me.
That's curious.
What about you?
A minor question I had was, what legacies of slavery are we still missing? Are still unseen, I should say. How can those be rectified, right? Kind of in that question on the reticence to learning history. It's like, this history is truly important. How can we connect it to the modern day in a way that promotes action? On the outside of the book question, what happened to Angela Davis? What happened?
Yeah, I mean, I know that her work on prison abolition is still well lauded within the context of that conversation.
I thought Our Prison's Obsolete was a much older book than it is. That shit is from 2003.
Yeah. And so, like, she's obviously still doing valuable work, but she is not at the level of revolutionary activism that she once was.
I guess my better question is really just, where are the old guard at? Where the old guard at?
Or where is the new guard, I mean...
Man.
I mean, maybe that's an unfair question, because here we are as people that could be participating in some way and we are not. It's as though we're expecting it to happen rather than making it happen.
Yeah, maybe that question actually is preconditioning me to expect an old guard, to expect a previous structure when our liberation will require the creation of a new structure.
You sound so exhausted already.
Yeah. Those are mine.
Fair. Well, loyal listener, that was Women, Race, and Class by Angela Y. Davis.
I think you should read this book if you want a really well drawn out and well sourced picture at the intersection, right? Women, race, and class. I'm a white man. That's well known. This was really informative to me, even though I knew a lot of the history of this stuff. And yeah, I think it was well worth a read.
Yeah, I think you should read this book if the only history you know came from your 10th grade U.S. history textbook.
That's a great point.
I think you should read this book if you feel like you understand 1 to 2 of these intersections, but not how all 3 come together. The intersection of gender, race, and class are valid and tightly woven.
I actually love that because many people are quite familiar with women and race, but maybe not so much the class. And Angela Davis really does bring a class aspect to this, obviously. She's clearly a Marxist.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For sure.
There's no questioning her bona fides there.
Bona fides. Okay.
Dead language. Sorry.
Loyal listener, any questions, thoughts, feedback, recommendations for further reading, whatever.
Yeah, hit us up.
Send those to
leftunreadfeedback@gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you. What are we reading next, Aaron?
Well, next time we're going to continue our reading of Capital. We're going to read Capital chapters 3 through 6.
Yes, I sure hope you will join us. And don't get left unread.
Absolutely. Bye-bye.
See ya.